The countdown to the release of Fantasian Neo Dimension on December 5th has begun. I don't feel like I'm seeing quite enough excitement about it. See, I absolutely adore Fantasian. I played it on day one on an iPad with an Xbox controller when it released in 2021, and then again on day 134 when Part 2 released later that year. Comment down below if you've played the game too, or if you're excited for the upcoming release of Fantasian Neo Dimension. Fantasian is a JRPG developed by MISTWALKER, the studio founded by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, and it's one of my favourite studios. They made games like Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey, two of my favourite RPGs on the Xbox. Not that they have a lot of competition, but they're both very good. And Lost Odyssey in particular has regularly been considered by the community as a unofficial Final Fantasy game. Originally, Fantasian was going to be Sakaguchi's final game. Now, this no longer appears to be the case, thankfully, but it did really set a tone. Fantasian was really set to be a game of lasts, with it also being Nobuo Uematsu's final, complete, original soundtrack. You could say it's something of a final Fantasian. That's not to say he won't be working on video game music in the future, as he's very recently clarified he will. With such big names working on the game, why do I feel like it's slipped under the radar and has remained quite underrated? Well, that's largely due to the platform it was originally released on, that platform being Apple Arcade. Apple Arcade requires you to have some sort of powerful enough Apple device to play the game. I don't use Apple, I have an Apple TV now, but when Fantasian came out, I had no Apple devices at all. Luckily, my girlfriend is deep into the ecosystem, so I was able to borrow her iPad Pro and play on that, and that worked actually very well. I didn't really feel like I was missing anything, because Apple Arcade games require developers to add a form of controller support for things like the Apple TV if people want to play on that. With the game released on Apple Arcade, many could not play it, and it's really such a shame because Fantasian is something special. But anyone aware of the game knows what its most standout feature is, and that's the art style. With environments made up of over 150 handcrafted dioramas, they have people who worked on things like Attack on Titan, Godzilla, and that's a selling point to me if they worked on Godzilla. These dioramas were then photographed from 200 to 300 different angles and then projected onto the 3D environment. The look really harkens back to excellent pre-rendered backgrounds, which makes sense if you look at games that Sakaguchi has done in the past, like Final Fantasy IX. I really love the look, and some very lucky people were able to win actual pieces of the dioramas that made up the environments of this game in a Famitsu giveaway quite a while back now, and I'm very jealous. I'd love to have a piece of this game to just place on the shelf. And the dioramas are what initially drew me to this game before I had any idea who was working on it or anything about it at all. I just saw the dioramas and I thought, that looks cool. And it's just so unique to see dioramas in a game like this. But this isn't Mistwalker's first rodeo, to be honest with you. They have used dioramas in their mobile game Terror Wars in the past. Does that look a bit familiar? Yeah, it's essentially the same place, but they really perfected the style with Fantasian. It just looks so good. But that's not to say the environments truly look perfect. But that's not a bad thing either. I came to realise that it was the imperfection that's part of the reason I think it just looks so damn good. Let me explain. You see, in many games, digital artists add imperfections to make the world feel lived in, you know, cracks in the walls, splinters in the wood. Things feel more real, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a skill and an art in its own right. But something about Fantasian feels different. That's because the signs of construction are really there, but with everything being handcrafted and painted, there are imperfections. There are seams in the material, you can see the paint streaks at times. Every flaw, every mistake, no matter how small, really shows itself as an element of the construction. And there's some real beauty in that imperfection. I mean, look at nearly any building, anywhere you walk down the street. If you look close, things aren't perfect. And the mistakes weren't intentional additions. They just happened because people worked on them. And that's what you see with Fantasian. I posted online back in January about just how stunning I think the game is when I went to replay the game when I got an Apple TV and wanted to be able to play it on my TV. And Sakaguchi saw it and replied, which was really nice. But the visuals aren't just pretty. The dioramas themselves are at the core of the design of the game. Not just the visual design, but also the gameplay. Usually, environments are designed around the mechanics and gameplay, but in some cases in Fantasian that's not the case, it's the other way around. The combat is based on random encounters, which to many is seen as an archaic feature in the modern era. Not to me, I actually still like random encounters, but I know it's not for everybody. But regardless, Fantasian has an excellent workaround which can please everyone. In an interview, Sakaguchi said that he enjoyed watching the characters, Leo and the others, sort of walk around and explore the diorama world. Rightfully so, it's absolutely beautiful. And he said that it felt a shame to take the player out of that with a random encounter every few steps. So eventually they came up with the dimension system, which is a mechanism where enemy encounters are stored in this machine, and unless you're encountering an enemy for the first time, in which case the random encounter is instant, they're just stored and you can choose when to fight the entire collected group of enemies. And that's a really elegant solution to the problem. It really does modernise the mechanic and I really like it. I've not seen that sort of mechanic in any other game. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but personally I've not played a game where that is a feature. The combat is also turn-based, which is obviously a staple in older RPGs, and still some modern ones. I mean, I wouldn't be a Dragon Quest fan if I didn't like turn-based combat, would I? But the turn-based combat in Fantasian isn't standard command-based. Other factors are relevant, such as positioning, there's area of effect attacks, power-ups which appear at random, which might make you want to change the trajectory of your attacks, because it's more of a spatial focus. And we're not fighting the monsters from the dimension and actually fighting in the diorama overworld. It really sort of brings it all together and makes the spatial environment part of the combat. All of this and Nobuo Uematsu's more experimental soundtrack, which I actually really like, make Fantasian really special. But Uematsu didn't only contribute the music to Fantasian. One of my favourite features in Fantasian and Lost Odyssey are the sort of visual novel elements, which sort of help to fill in the memories and the history of the characters and of the world at large. And I find myself looking forward to the next one. They're a bit more few and far between in Fantasian than they were in Lost Odyssey, but when they do appear, I really enjoy them. And Uematsu contributed his own, but it's more of a side story and not really a piece of the story itself. A while back I imported the CD soundtrack for Fantasian, but also it comes with this booklet. It's his visual novel in book form, which I thought was a really nice thing to include as part of the package for the CD soundtrack, considering he did the music, he did that, why not include it as well? I'm getting a bit sidetracked. I really think Fantasian deserves more attention, and it deserves your attention. But it's not only me that thinks Fantasian deserves wider attention. Naoki Yoshida, or Yoshi-P as he's often known in the Final Fantasy community. He's known mainly as the director for Final Fantasy XIV, but he's also been producer of Final Fantasy XVI and a number of other games. And Final Fantasy XIV, funnily enough, is a game that Sakaguchi is quite obsessed with. So it makes sense that Sakaguchi would approach Yoshi-P for help in bringing this game out of its Apple Arcade prison onto more platforms to make it available to a much wider audience. So here we have the man who saved Final Fantasy XIV from abject failure, coming to rescue Fantasian from its platform-caused obscurity. It's almost poetic, really. And that brings us to now. Fantasian Neo Dimension is coming. And there are a number of changes been made in Fantasian Neo Dimension that were not present in the original game. Voice acting, for one. Both English and Japanese voice acting. That was the suggestion of Yoshi-P as a way to modernise it for modern audiences. And that really sort of links back to Fantasian being something of a modernisation and a modern twist of old school RPGs. Originally when I played the game, I found it to be, frankly, brutally difficult. Part 1 was fine. I played through that with minimal issues, not even really the bosses I had too much trouble with. Maybe a few attempts for one or two of them. But when Part 2 released, it felt like the difficulty went from here up to hugely out of frame. I really had a hard time beating Part 2, especially some of the final bosses in the game. And in Fantasian Neo Dimension, they're adding a normal difficulty, which is the easier of the two difficulties. So it sounds like they recognised that the game was very difficult when it released. And I think that's fine. It's good for accessibility. I'm glad that's the thing that's being added. I'm really looking forward to being able to place a real copy of Fantasian Neo Dimension on my MISTWALKER shelf, and hopefully one day they release an art book for the game, because I can't think of a single game which would have a more interesting, or maybe even be more deserving of an art book than Fantasian. I would kill for an art book, so please, MISTWALKER, Square, whoever it is who would be responsible, please consider releasing an art book, because that would be so good. I do hope that if you get the game, you end up enjoying the game as much as I did, and as much as I will again when I get Fantasian Neo Dimension. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.